Hello and good morning. There was a lot of talk yesterday about Timmy in my Discord. And by Timmy, I mean News Now OKC. I'm drinking my chemical-laden beverage, so you'll have to forgive me if I stop to take a sip. The conversation yesterday centered around CJ Grisham, aka Tiny Grisham, aka Chicken Hawk, making two claims. Claim number one is that an officer can't demand ID in Texas, but for 3802, which is the requirement to show ID upon demand if you've been arrested. And CJ Grisham calling for a call flood and saying he was going to sue the sheriff that demanded Timmy's ID. I don't know if anybody else paid attention to Timmy's little road trip to Arizona. Along the way to Arizona, he stopped in some town in Texas to cop watch, and the cops noticed that Timmy had a firearm on his hip, and one of the deputies demanded Timmy's ID, and Timmy coughed it up. Timmy said there was reciprocity laws between Texas and Oklahoma as far as the open carry, concealed carry, permitted carry, and Timmy was right. The officer said, well, I don't know if I'm going to recognize that. But the officer checked out the ID and the license, handed it back to Timmy. They escorted Timmy across the street to a safe distance that they felt was safe, whatever. And they continued about their business. Timmy was not detained or arrested. So the question becomes, is there standing to sue? Now, in your first year in law school, or at least in my first year in law school, I had federal rules of civil procedure. And one of the first things they teach you about is justiciability, the ability to bring a case to federal court. And there was a mnemonic that they taught to help you remember the 5 different things you needed in order to bring a federal lawsuit. That acronym or that mnemonic was RAMPS. And RAMPS stands for ripeness. A stands for abstention doctrine. M stands for mootness. P stands for political questions. And S stands for standing. So does CJ Grisham have standing to bring a lawsuit against that officer? And the answer to that question is probably no. In order to have standing, you have to be harmed. You have to be injured. You have to be damaged. CJ Grisham wasn't injured or damaged. That damage has to be directly related to the perceived illegal or unlawful activity. Again, CJ Grisham wasn't damaged. And it has to be something that the court can make you whole for. So by damages or by an injunction or something like that. Now, just generalized grievances don't qualify. So if you're typing on your keyboard right now that, well, if cops can demand your ID for open carrying, that's a political question. That's a generalized thing. Doesn't work. You need a specific thing. Anyway, so I don't think that CJ Grisham has standing to sue. Does Timmy? Well, it's going to be harder for Timmy to prove that he was actually harmed too. Unlike in First Amendment cases where if the officer, like if Timmy was trying to exercise his freedom of speech, and he wasn't, he was trying to record the police, That is kind of a function of the First Amendment, but it's But if they trespassed him, they said, you can't come here. Or if you film us, then we're going to arrest you. Whether they do or they don't, just by their actions, they've chilled his free speech. I mean, he's going to be less likely to engage in it. But demanding his ID isn't, especially after they allow him to continue to film when he's done, is probably not going to be construed as chilling. It's probably not a First Amendment issue. It's probably a Fourth Amendment issue. The court will probably review it under a Fourth Amendment analysis and go from there. They didn't arrest him for failure to ID or anything like that, so I don't think there was any damages. I don't think Timmy has standing. But a court could prove me wrong on that. I'm not 100% on that. Courts have proven me wrong before on things like that. So then the question becomes, did Timmy have to ID? And there was a lot of stuff being thrown around my Discord yesterday. Auditor Truth pulled up the Texas government code 411.205. I'm going to go with 411.205. 411 is easy to remember. That's information, baby. But anyway, so he pulls this up, and it says that a license to carry holder, if he has a firearm on him, has to present his license to carry along with his driver's license upon demand by the police. Now, at a casual reading, that might sound like whenever an officer demands, you have to cough up the ID. And I'm not 100% sold on it. I've looked into it a little bit. I haven't gone totally in depth researching it, but I've looked into it a little bit. And my understanding is that the general consensus is if the officer has reasonable suspicion, he can demand your ID. And he can get reasonable suspicion because you have to have a license to carry to open carry. So if he sees you open carrying, he can demand your license thinking that you may not have a license. Thus, you may be in violation of the law and you have to cough it up. Now, there's no actual penalty for failing to cough up your license to carry. It is on the books, but there is no penalty associated with it. So what could happen? Well, again, the general consensus seems to be that if you don't cough up your license, then the officer can arrest you. He would then have probable cause, according to the general consensus, that you are, in fact, carrying without a license. So you're unlawful carrying. So then he could arrest you, and then he could demand your ID. And under 3802, you've got to produce it. And I don't know about that. And when I say I don't know about that, I mean Timmy should have not ID'd, and then we could get some answers on this shit. Because here's what I think. I think if you look at Brown v. Texas, and if you look at Hibble v. the 6th District Court of Nevada, or whatever it is, you'll see that in order to demand ID, cops have to have reasonable suspicion. Now, to get that reasonable suspicion under the generally accepted analysis, well, you have to have a license to carry. It's illegal to carry a firearm, a pistol, on your hip in Texas without a license. Well, the funny thing is, it's also illegal to drive a car in Texas without a license. And yet the cops can't pull you over willy-nilly to demand your ID for driving a car. They have to actually still have reasonable fucking suspicion. It is illegal to drive a car without a license, but they still need reasonable suspicion to pull you over. You have to violate some law in order for them to pull you over. I don't understand why that wouldn't apply to this government code section 411.02 or 205. I still think you need reasonable suspicion to demand that ID. And I think that Timmy, if he wasn't such a spineless twat, should have, would have, and could have been able to challenge that. That might be something for Tiny Grisham to work on. Instead of call flooding and suing, he should get standing if he really wants to challenge it. and see where it goes from there. But Hibble was pretty clear that you need at a minimum reasonable suspicion. And Hibble actually was pointing at, well, it's due to the nature of the domestic violence. You know, they need to know right now because there's potential harm and this and that and the other thing. So, I mean, it might not just be reasonable suspicion. It might be reasonable suspicion plus like imminent harm that is the necessary ingredient to be able to demand ID. But what do I know? I'm just a first-year family law attorney. And when I say that Timmy is a weak, spineless little twat, what I really mean is that every time I turn around, Timmy says he's standing for something, but he doesn't stand for anything. He folds like a cheap suit. I'm not a huge fan of the inland checkpoints, of the inland border control checkpoints. I personally think that they should be found to be unconstitutional. I realize they're not. And what we really need in order to challenge them is someone to be detained for a long period of time and then push that all the way up. Because I forget the name of the case that established that the inland border patrol checkpoints were legal, but the underlying assumption was that the detention was reasonable, that the search was reasonable because it was so short, like 30 seconds ish, and then you were on your way. Well, Martinez Fuerte, I think it was. Martinez Fuerte sounds familiar. Anyway, if someone is detained for 2, 3, 10 hours, then all of a sudden, then maybe we can start to get some more clearly defined lines of how long they can reasonably detain you to demand your ID. And maybe we can also, I mean, I think they can actually demand your ID again under Hibble. It's retarded, but all of a sudden you have an obligation to actually speak. You have an obligation to verbalize and assist in the investigation of you with law enforcement, which I think was a terrible decision, but there you go. But anyway, we need someone to challenge it, not some douche canoe rolling through with a box van who folds at the very first sign of any trouble. If you're not going to play the game, don't play the game. I hope nobody else donates to him ever again because he's a fraud. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.